All right. Good morning, Nick. How are you?
Good morning, Wrecker. Great. How are you?
Yeah, I'm okay. I'm okay. Thank you. Yeah. Look, we got a fair bit of feedback on our last episode. Our last episode being the who reviews the reviewers. That really hit a spot with people that are listening to our podcast.
Yeah, we got some people letting us know that they agree with us and they disagree with us. They really didn't like the, schedule time every week. People are like, I can't do a review in a week. I'm too busy. It's like we're all too busy, you know.
Yeah, and I think that was the point you're making, right? It wasn't really that you asked people to do reviewing on Saturday mornings, but rather that you find like that you explicitly put it in your list of priorities.
So just in case anyone's listening to this, the other feedback we got, it looks like we're going to be doing something at ICIS this year, right? So we'll figure out, we're having a meeting next week to talk about it. But I guess if anyone has ideas for what we should do at ISIS, it might be fun.
Yeah, yeah.
And if there should be drinking involved or not, I mean, can we do that?
Well, I think they should be drinking involved. I mean, it's ISIS after all. I've rarely seen one of these sessions sober. Just
don't give
joking.
away
No.
your secrets.
Yeah, well, I think this is the podcast of the secrets. No, but seriously, there was this one. I think it was on LinkedIn. So he said a freshly minted assistant professor called out and said, "Okay, what's the benefit of it all, right?" So he was saying, "Look, I'm rejecting a lot of the reviewing invitations because the time frame appears ludicrous, too short, and I don't know why I would be doing this in the first place." And I said something like, look, that's exactly the point, that you find a short time frame to be ludicrous, but it's only because our frame of reference, our expectation, our norm is that we expected that they give us a couple of months to do it. That was basically the point we wanted to make, right?
And what's funny is no matter who, I talk to a lot of people about this and they wait until they get it's due in a week to even look at it anyway. So in actuality, or it's overdue, and then they fit it in that week. So in actuality, they're doing it in a week turnaround. They're just waiting a couple months to do their 1 week turnaround.
Yeah, and that's what I said as well. When I said, look, if I look at what I do when I review, I need a couple of hours. The question is just when do I do these couple of hours to do this, and whether I spread it over a day or two, but certainly not over weeks and months.
You know what it is, Wrecker? It's your moral obligation, if you are making people read your shitty work, to read their shitty work and give them comments on it, right? So if you're actively submitting papers, it is your moral obligation to review other people's papers. And ideally, you should do it in a timely fashion. Now, if morals don't mean anything to you and you don't care about being immoral, then it's very different. If your own whole reason is instrumental, right? I just want to do what helps my career. Well, then there's more of an argument for not doing reviews. But even then, I don't think that helps your career because you never become an editor.
Right? Yeah, that's right. Because that's the point that I made in the LinkedIn response to the comment. And I feel like we should have talked about this as well. I think there's incredible benefits to reviewing. The problem is that they accrue late. They're not immediate. Yeah. It's not like an instant gratification. You do a review and boom, tomorrow I wake up and I gain 3 IQ points, right? But over time, over a long period of time, 5-10 years, I think you notice how you got better by just, you see a lot more research, not just you're not sampling on the dependent variables. You're not only seeing the papers that do get published, you also learn from failure, right? I mean, that's number one, right? You see a lot of stuff. You see a lot of procedures and approaches by other people, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And, all of that is incredibly helpful. And also thinking that, sort of reviewing and that later leads to editorial work, I think that's the number one thing that makes you better as a researcher yourself.
Yeah. So that dovetails to what I want to talk about today. We have this thing I'm doing at MISQ where as an AE that's been around for a while, we're going to be training new AEs to MISQ about how to do them about how to do reviews and how to think about reviews. And one of the discussions that we had, the group of us who are doing it.
So wait, you're doing an AE development workshop or what?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I guess there's an SE development workshop too, isn't there? Did you see that?
I have not been developed as an SE.
You need it, actually.
No, yeah.
I've worked with you as an SE. Yeah. So we do. And
so that makes us the most influential IS podcast here, because we call them out and saying like we got we need editor development training, and a week later you're telling me there is. It's clearly our doing. Causality, very clearly. This is the trigger.
So yeah, Ningnan and Jinjin Li and I are going to be, just leading a discussion. We're not really teaching anything because these are all accomplished people that are associate editors at MISQ, but we want to lead a discussion. And one of the discussions we want to lead, and this is what we as a group we're having difficulty, talking about is a contribution. Right. And I think that's the one thing. If you do a lot of reviewing, if you do a lot of editing, you see the background work and you can see what constitutes a contribution and what doesn't. Right. And this is what we should talk about, because I had a paper actually recently rejected. And of course, there were some little things here and there, but the main point of this paper, of this rejection, was it's not surprising. I expected this, right? So what you're doing is you did a whole entire, and I'm not going to get too much into the paper, but you did this entire thorough analysis of some data, and you came up with some conclusions, and those conclusions are obvious to me. So although you did some nice work, reject, right? So I'm simplifying it for the purposes of discussion. But my question to you, Recker, is this: do I need to surprise you to make a contribution? Right? We're going to talk about contributions today. That's our theme.
Yeah.
Does that sound good to you?
Yeah, no, it's great. It's great. I think there's.
So does it have to be surprising? Is my first question to you.
I think there's multiple layers to this, right? So the obvious answer is no. A contribution is a contribution. It has nothing to do with it being surprising or obvious. For one thing, a lot of the very good theoretical contributions, they appear obvious now that someone has set and developed them, right? A lot of the good theories, I said, like they're so good in explaining things that everyone looks at them like, oh yeah, well, of course it's that.
Well, Herb Simon got a Nobel Prize for telling economists what everybody knows. All right. Economists, for some reason, live in a bubble where they think that up until 1956, they thought that we had perfect rationality. And then Herb Simon comes out and says, well, we have bounded rationality. We're limited by our attention, and we're limited, we have, okay, Nobel Prize. That something my mother knows, right? Well, doesn't everyone know about bounded rationality?
Yeah, I mean, that's the point, right? So that's the obvious answer. But of course, there's a lot of nuances and shades to it. Because for one thing, one point is, what is the contribution? The second one is, how is your rhetoric? How do you frame it? Can you make it interesting, even though it appears obvious? Doesn't necessarily mean you can, it can still be a surprise. If you think it as a corpus of text, as a story, there still can be a surprise, like in the same sense that there could be crime novels, and we know from page one who the murderer is, it could still be a surprising sort of good story. So I think these two things are separate, right?
And that's the key to Herb Simon, right? It's not identifying that there is this thing called bounded rationality. It's unpacking bounded rationality and the sources of bounded rationality and how bounded rationality affects decisions and how it leads to satisficing, right? That system that he developed, I think, is the key to his Nobel Prize, not the obvious observation, right?
I mean,
so it's the unpacking.
I always think of it the same thing. If you read Kahneman's book, yeah. And then you look at it like, oh yeah, well, the two different type of cognitive systems, system one, system two. Well, that's kind of obvious, sort of like I make gut decisions, or I think about stuff, and depending on which one I use, I come to different conclusions. Well, that seems very obvious. But if you read it carefully, you see like, wow, there's 40 years of experimental programmatic research to really carve out all the nuances, etc. So, it may appear obvious. And also that's the way that particular book is written. But, it's not necessarily obvious per se. And then the obvious other criticism is that, well, it's still a contribution, even if it is obvious, if you're the first one to say it and to, demonstrate or substantiate or provide evidence for it, and no one else has done that, that's still a contribution, wouldn't it be?
So in my PhD, Scott Shane, I don't know if you know him, he's a professor.
Yeah, he's the entrepreneurship guy. Yeah,
he's an entrepreneurship guy, and he led this little workshop on entrepreneurship, and I remember he put one of his own papers in the workshop, and I was reading it, and I don't remember the details, but it was basically that startups will get funded closer to where they were founded rather than further away from where they were founded. And I remember raising my hand in a workshop. I'm like, of all the things you could do research on, why this is the most obvious finding in the world. Of course, people will get funded closer to where they were founded than further away. We wouldn't expect any different. Why bother doing this research? And his answer is kind of interesting. He goes, yeah, I guess it is kind of obvious, but we don't know if the obvious conclusion is actually valid. There are a lot of things we actually thought were obvious that we never found support for. So what we did is found support for something that you seem to think is obvious, but we empirically showed it, and that's a contribution to the discourse. And that was his perspective on it. And I understand that, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a path to contribution, claiming a contribution that's completely valid, and it's one that we've seen a lot when we talked about econometrics papers with Brad. He talked about his Uber case, and he said, well, it's sort of obvious, he talked about Uber and drunk driving, right? That's his paper. And he said, well, the problem that they had is that it sort of feels obvious that, of course, there'll be less drunk driving now that we have Uber. So that's not really the point. So they try to construct a slightly different story, which
but do you remember how he said he got published? Do you remember what he said to?
Actually, I don't know.
Yeah, so he said that it was kind of obvious. And if it were just that, they probably wouldn't have gotten published. At least this is what I remember him saying. Problem with being recorded is I can't bullshit as much anymore and just say because you could just go back to the recording and see what he actually said. But I believe what he said was that in that paper, they found something like, Uber Black, which is the premium Uber,
That's right. Yeah.
had no impact. However,
That's right.
Uber X did. So there was this subgroup in it. There was this moderator interaction effect, right? And then that's what made it interesting. And that's what they beat him up on. And to show something is obvious, but doesn't always hold, right, is one of the approaches to making it.
One way to put it is like, I would have said, like, they had this obvious contribution, but they identified all the nuances to it. Like in German, you have all the different dimensions of it. Or if you like theory language, you would say, well, I'm just going to give you the constructs and the relationship, but I'm also telling you about the boundary conditions. If you think about it this way, not a lot of papers do this. Not a lot of papers explore boundary conditions like that.
Absolutely.
Right? So that's one way to think about it. And the other one, and I'm just paraphrasing here because this is not actually the point that we made, is actually a comment that we got on LinkedIn about the question between the relationship between interestingness, is that a word? And contribution, right?
In German, don't you just stick a whole bunch of words together and make up any word you want?
Absolutely.
Like, what would that be in German? Interestingness with multiple words. You don't know? Do you speak German?
No. See, like when I'm in English, I'm horrible in German. I'm trying to figure out what interestingness means in German. It'd be
So you actually just think in English when you're in English.
Well,
we were on Zoom the other week with Stefan Zeidel, Jan Mendling, and you. Yeah. And I go off to get a drink.
And we spoke to German. Yeah.
And it was so cool because you guys are like rattling off in German. I sit down with my drink. You don't skip a beat. Everybody just continues talking, but now it's in English. That is so admirable.
But as a foreign language speaker, which I am, obviously, it's you always adjust your language to the context. So I can't talk German to you because you're in English. Also, my English to you is different to an Aussie English. So my English is very different now. So, and when I speak to other Germans that have sort of broken English, my English gets worse. And we're completely digressing, and no one cares about it.
We want to talk about this for a second. You might not know this, but English is actually my second language. I didn't learn English until I was about 5 years old. I only spoke Hungarian, right? So I grew up in this neighborhood of Cleveland but what's funny is in my house growing up, there was like this weird mix of English and Hungarian where you would just speak in English and grab a Hungarian word, or if you're speaking in Hungarian, you would throw an English word in. And it was exactly that. We didn't segment it the way you seem to, where you're either
no. I have ever since I came back to Germany, like I still sometimes only find the English word to use in my German conversation. So I throw in a bunch of English words, which is fine because everyone speaks English anyway. But wait, so Berente, is that a Hungarian word?
Yeah, there's actually a little city in Hungary, Berente. So Berente, Miklos Tibor is my name. And Miklos, I guess, is Nicholas. That's why that translation happened, at least according to my mother. But yeah, there's a little town called Berente in Hungary. And it recently claimed independence
So this is not only the most influential podcast, but also the most personal. Like listeners, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of listeners because they want to figure out where the two of us.
Yeah, they want to know about our background language. Well, all right. So now we know at least we know you're an Australian German, and we know
you're a Hungarian English roots. And Hungary English guy. So let me get back to this point, because we started. I wanted to bring up this notion of a paper being interesting, and there is this wonderful paper from 1971 that you sent me. I knew it. That's the one that I want to bring up. Jan Mentling, a friend of ours, who brought it up in the comments as well. This is really the paper that talks about making a paper interesting.
Murray Davis, we got to post it in our.
That's right. We post it in the show notes. But I love this paper because I really think this is such good rhetoric advice to identifying and very clearly spelling out what makes your contribution in your paper interesting. And the idea of that paper is very simple, right? He says, figure out what the current assumption is in the conversation that you're in, and then just deny it.
Well, and that's one way. So I was going to get to that, but what we started with was obvious. All right, so let's get to Murray Davis in a second. I want to continue because I think there are two ways of making an obvious contribution still a contribution.
Okay.
And I think the one way is what you were talking about with Brad Greenwood and that Uber paper. It's there's an obvious kind of main effect here. So let's think of the boundary conditions, the subgroups, and the moderators, the interactions, add some nuance to that main effect. And that's what'll get you. And that's a publication, particularly if no one has done it before. The other one, and I want to point out to a paper in MISQ, and I like this paper a lot. It's 2013. It's a guy, I've never met him, Joao Vieira de Cunha. So Cunha, I guess he's in Portugal, but I follow him on Twitter. He's always doing things on Twitter. But he has this paper in 2013 about the dramaturgical model and the production of performance data. So what he's basically saying, he did this ethnography, and he's talking about how if we're measuring people's performance, they and their managers together have a process through which they present their performance in a way that manages impressions, right? So someone could look at this and go, well, that's obvious. We know people do impression management, and we know people and their managers, like salespeople, you can think of that, will always try and spin their sales results in the best light. So we know that. So someone could look at this paper and say, well, that's obvious, right? But if you look at what he did in the paper, he has an incredibly thorough unpacking of how the individual interacts with the manager, how they give off impressions, right? How they form the impressions after giving, right? What he did was took the obvious thing and unpacked it. And this is kind of what Herb Simon did with bounded rationality. Yes, we know people are limited in their rationality, but let's talk about what and how and what the impact is of this and how they resolve it. And that's what I think he does with this, Cunha does with this dramaturgical model, which is, yes, we know people do impression management and they spin their performance data in the best light. So how do they do it? Unpack it. And I think those are the two ways to do an obvious contribution.
If I try to put them into strategies, the one would be you take an obvious contribution and you add the nuances, which is sort of like the edges of it, right? And what you're suggesting now is you take something that looks obvious and you unpack it. So you drill down. You decompose, you show us the inner workings, strategy people call it the micro foundations, you unblack box stuff, blah, blah, blah. You look into the inside basically, right?
Exactly. You're a good student, Ricker.
Yeah, I'm a good student.
I give you an A for that.
It reminds me, maybe you know this, it reminds me of this introspection and what's the other one called? I will have to look this up. I think it's by Kuhn, but not by Thomas Kuhn, by a different Kuhn. And he wrote about theoretical advance. And he said, well, there's two ways of doing this. You can go deeper inside. So like you take the core construct and you drill down and you figure out more about it on the inside. Or you take the same ideas and you go out and apply them elsewhere. So they're like, you explore the boundary conditions, or in Lakator's sense, you would say like you take your assumptions that you agree on, but you see whether they hold in this other context over there. Right, in the protective belt, so sort of out there where we don't know whether the assumptions still hold. So they're all the same idea, I guess, right?
Well, but now what you're doing is you're moving on to what you said, and what you just said when you brought up Murray Davis's paper is you said he gives you, the word you used was rhetoric, And that's what I think Murray Davis's paper is wonderful with, because now we're saying, okay, we've so far been talking about constructing the obvious. What you're talking about is classic contribution. And classic contribution is a rhetorical move that necessarily attends to existing knowledge and constructs it in such a way that existing knowledge, you set up the assumptions to show that your study in some way overturns or questions or undermines those assumptions a little bit.
Exactly.
He says that if everyone thinks something is one thing, you show that it's two things. If everyone thinks it's two things, you show that it's one thing, right?
Exactly.
But you have to set up rhetorically the assumptions first, right?
And there's also an assumption in all of that. Yeah, I think you portrayed right? And he has these 5-6 categories. He said, like, okay, abstraction, what we think is individual is holistic, what we think is holistic is really individual, etc. All of that, in a way, would be that you're shifting a dialogue that's already existing.
Right.
Yeah? Because otherwise, if you're starting a new dialogue, well, then there's no assumptions, that you can play around with. So what you're doing here is you're taking you always say, like, you hook into conversation, sorry, and and you're shifting it by saying, look, guys, we used to assume that it's this way, but it really is this other thing.
It's the conversing idea.
Yeah. Exactly, right? But in that space, if that's what you're doing, I always think that going back to Davis and thinking about some of these 6-7 categories, very operational, and so, like, which of them applies to the situation that I have with my paper, that really helps you carving out this contribution, which really helps addressing some of these reviewer comments where they apply this very subjective comments like, well, I'm not sure this is enough of a contribution for this journal or that journal, which is a classic review comment that you get, right? So I have no problem with the procedures, but is this really enough for, the quarterly or some other journal, which is always very arbitrary, so to speak, very subjective, because we don't have a golden rule. We don't have a threshold by which we can evaluate. Exactly. So that's why these rhetoric, stylistic strategies are so important. Right? Because if it is subjective, then I need to go out and convince this reviewer. And the only way that I have that is by my written word, right?
Rhetoric. Yeah.
By my rhetoric. Exactly. And that's why that is important. And that's why when we talk about contribution, we need to talk about which contributions are interesting.
Yeah. So interesting. But what's interesting too is the word contribution. It necessarily implies contribution to something. All right. So whenever you say there's not enough of a contribution, the question is contribution to what? Right. Well, to theory, right? Which theory? Whose theory? Which perspective? Right. And then that's where you have to set up the rhetoric. That's why the rhetorical setup is so important, because that.
What I did in preparation for this, I wrote on a few example papers that I felt were doing what Murray Davis said. In sort of our space. So I'm going to read out of them. I'm pretty sure you know these papers, and you can tell me whether you agree. So, for example, there is Fajun et al., Dualism and Duality.
Oh, I love this paper.
Yeah, that's a great paper. I think that's an interesting paper.
That's one of the best papers of the last 20 years, I think.
I think it's 2010, what AMR, is it? Yeah.
Yeah, AMR, and it's a conceptual piece.
Around 2010. Yeah, but what they're doing, if you think about it, they're doing exactly what Murray Davis said would make a paper interesting. They said, we think about dualisms, but, we should really be thinking about duality. So sort of like one thing having one side and a different side, but rather they have both sides, Yeah,
what he's saying is we tend to think of stability and for those of you like me who get confused with dualism versus duality. The idea is that stability and flexibility, right? We usually think of them in opposition. And what he puts in that paper is simply that, well, actually, in order to get flexibility, you need stability. You can't have infinite flexibility. You need stability somewhere to have flexibility other places. Similarly, you need flexibility in certain places in order to have stability. You need these buffers and these, right? So what was an opposite, and again, it's obvious, but it's beautiful. And he gives a couple examples, whatever, routine theory and institutional theory and whatever he does in that paper. But yeah, it's a great paper.
If people, like, that's what I mean. Like, if people want to figure out how to apply these ideas by Davis, what that really looks like in the paper, I think that's a great example. I'm going to give you a different one that's probably not as well known because it's very recent. There's a new paper in MIS Quarterly by Emma Vast and Alan Pinsonal on digital technologies and occupational identity.
Okay.
It's forthcoming, sort of like, it probably comes out in the next issue, whatever, or in, later this year. Whatever.
Are you the editor of it, or you just came across it?
What can I say that now? Yeah, I've been one of the editors on this paper, so when it's out, it'll show, I guess. But this, I think this is going to be a brilliant piece. What they've done is they've taken the occupational identity of a particular group, data scientists, and they said, well, you have digital technologies, new sort of analytics algorithm, these sorts of things, and they do two things at the same time. They establish a new identity and they threaten it at the same time. As a statistician moves to becoming a really cool, hot and sexy data scientist. That's what they looked at. And they looked at how the community of people that are sort of, I'm an analyst, I'm a statistician, or now I'm a data scientist, how they constantly at the same time being, sort of enabled and threatened by the same technologies and the same sort of developments that sort of give rise to this profession and, threaten to break it apart. Really cool. And they come out, they create a process model of how they handle that over time. Yeah. Really, really, really cool. And it's the same example.
It complicates the relationship between the identity and the technology.
That's right. And then they say, well, that's really a process. I don't have an identity. It really is an ongoing process where, certain dialectical forces, I need to sort of move between them. Really, really cool.
That's the identity work idea. Yeah.
So exactly right.
You know what? Let me give you an example before you continue with your list. Our special issue editorial, and you tell me what you think about this, because I think it's kind of funny. Our special issue editorial, one of the things, and this is your phrasing, the frontier idea, right? We're supposed to define artificial intelligence because it's a special issue about artificial intelligence. So we need to at least start with the definition. So our little group of editors had this discussion that what is it? And we decided it's not one thing, it's a frontier. And if you look at some of the research on the history of AI, it basically, paints that picture that it's not one thing, it's a frontier. So we thought this was the really clever formulation of AI as a frontier. And I think that's new. And you turned around and said, well, this is what, a basic computer science textbook, right? This is not, we're spending too much time on the definition. I'm like, no, that's a contribution in itself. Because too often people think of AI as just machine learning, as whatever. And this is thinking of it as a frontier, is we should spend pages on this. And it's so,
come on.
And then Radhika finds some blog that says it's a frontier.
Okay, we got to give some more context here to people, right? So what we've been doing is we're writing an editorial about managing AI. And we got this idea of a frontier. But in developing this, we go back all the way back to Turing. You go all the way back to Turing. And what you did is you added a little, actually in the first draft version, you added a footnote, which was half a page long, where you explained to people what the imitation test by Turing was really about. And now,
which isn't what people think it was about.
Well, hang on. So I'm just giving some context here so that people see how we construct these papers. And I said, look, we can't do this. You're too textbookish. You're assuming people have no idea, and it's your job to educate them, and because you've read the book and stuff like this. And then and this is how we actually. It's a little footnote. It's basically, it's not even a sentence in the paper. It's basically a sentence adjacent to another sentence. But really, we think about these things and ask, okay, should that go on the paper? Where should it go? Is that a contribution or not? And we've been debating it. And I said it's not, and you said it is. That's basically the context of it all, right? Yeah. And you won. We should have put that out as well.
Well, I don't think the footnote made it in, but we might, I think, been through it in the back of the paper or something. But anyway, that is interesting, because if you think about it, this frontier idea, and McCorduck in I think it's a woman, I think, her history of AI, she has this, she describes her history in terms of this constantly moving frontier of AI, but people haven't picked it up in the literature anyway when people describe AI. Instead, they pretty much lately just talk about machine learning tools and that. And when you said a textbook, it's like, fine, this does exist. And some practitioners do think of AI as a frontier, and I've heard about AI as a frontier. So does it exist in the world? Sure. If you look at the literature, if you look at IS papers using AI, they don't think of it as a frontier. So my argument that it's a contribution, however, humble a contribution, is look, our discourse, it's to our discourse, and it's just level setting, saying, going forward, let's think of this as a frontier, not as a type of technology, right? And I think that's a contribution. And yes, it's judgment.
I agree. I agree about the idea per se. Now, that is another example actually of shifting the discourse. Let me talk a little bit more about this, because I was trying, as I told you, I was trying to identify exemplars from sort of close to IS that sort of do what Murray Davis wrote about in 1971, right? And then I thought about some other papers that I thought were interesting, and then realized, well, not all of them fit that bill. Not all of them are doing this Murray Davis, because as we just said, like that only works if you have an existing discourse and you're changing direction, you're shifting it, right? So a very different one is, of course, what people call I'm starting a discourse. I'm a conversation starter, right?
Yeah. Which is the hardest thing to do.
Which is probably the hardest thing to do. And very often these are the sort of agenda type setting papers. Just one example, 2010, Rick Watson and Steve Elliott, they wrote papers about information systems in sustainable development to start that conversation. Now, of course, there's been talk about sustainable development, and there's also been work on sustainable organizations and all that sort of stuff before. But in IS, that was literally absent, and they wanted to start that conversation. And the typical route, tell me if you agree, is this: some guy comes out and writes an issues and opinions paper and said we should be looking at this, we should start this conversation. And if it gets a little bit of traction, then they follow up these issues and opinion papers with a special issue. And the goal of most of these special issues is really to introduce a topic to the field, to attract research groups to their attention to do this. And ideally, the outcome of such a process is that after that, it just becomes a regular paper that is that's attractive to all sorts of journals, right? Which is, by the way, not what our managing AI special issue is. That's not a conversation starter. No. Not at all, right? So that doesn't fit that bill at all. But the Green IS movement by Rick and Steve and others, or what's his name, Arvind Malhotra, their work was really to get that conversation going.
In this group, in IS research, the whole idea when you talk about getting the conversation going, we know the sustainability conversation did not get going with that paper. Right. No. There has been, we've been discussing sustainability, for decades. At least some people were. Not everyone was. So the idea is to import, which I don't even know if they really did in that paper, but if there's a mature discourse in other fields, the way to start a discourse in this field is to draw on the discourse in the other fields. And I think oftentimes they don't do that, right? They tend to say, we're not doing this, let's do this, rather than trying to take, okay, what do we know? What do we know about measurement? What do we know about codification? What do we know about the things in sustainability that work? That we need to talk about, right? And there's a huge discourse when they wrote that paper. But yeah, you're right. They and again, it's rhetoric, right? As long as you frame it in a particular way, you can get it.
But they framed it. I remember one little sentence from Rick's paper in 2010. He had this very simple statement. He said, "Look, there's evidence that shows that a lot of the productivity improvements over the last 20th century, the second half of it, is to a very large extent due to IT." Yeah. So, we know we can be more productive. Well, can we also use the same power to become more sustainable? Yeah. That's a big thing he
pushed.
Very simple question, very clever, right? Because that's an obvious question to ask.
Yeah. And he would work with organizations. And one of the things I really loved about what he did is he didn't disassociate the two. He basically said, look, oftentimes when you're more sustainable, you're actually more efficient as well. Right. Yeah. So it's not like there's a huge cost.
That's the mantra of Wolf Ketter, my old colleague from Cologne, doing good by doing well, he says, doing good by doing well. Right. So he always tries to find the models that allow you to, meet sustainable development goals while making a profit. Because he says that's the only way you can get businesses to really get interested in that. Like they still got to make a buck, pretty good buck. And then, by hitting some ecological goals. I wanted to give you a different example, and you probably know this person because you were also at Case Western. I think Satish Nambisan's paper 2017, Digital Entrepreneurship, is a similar in setup in that he wanted to start this conversation, and he did a similar thing in that he basically just took conversations in two different streams. Here, entrepreneurship, here, digital innovation, and then he sort of meshed them together. Yeah. And that became a conversation starter into this area that people call digital entrepreneurship. There's many such examples, but that's one that I just thought of that is That is an interesting, because they all, to me, they all follow the same makeup, don't you think?
Yeah.
They usually go like, here's this discipline, they're pretty cool, and there's some obvious connections. So let's bring some of the concepts here and see what that looks like.
So what you just said is, all right, so Namison did it, Rick Watson did it. These are well-accomplished people who do it. I think giving people that as a formula, as conversation starter, is something that rookies, and I know a lot of people who are kind of earlier in their career might listen to our podcast. And that is advice I wouldn't give them. I would say, do not try to do conversation starters. And the reason being, probably for everyone that gets in, 30 get rejected, right? Because who knows what. I think they find their way in through some, half of them are invited, half of them, it's very difficult to get papers like that published, and for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, I agree on the second part, not on the first. So I think that they're very difficult to publish, because one of the things you need to do, you've got to be really, really good on the rhetoric part. You really need to know how to write. And very often, very young scholars just don't have that experience of, writing and being rejected 1,000 times until you really hit the nuances in writing. Every single word is careful. So that doesn't mean it's not possible. I don't want to tell my own.
Of course, it's possible.
But so my doctoral student, Roman Zeiss, who's finishing his PhD, he wrote a paper that I would classify as a conversation starter. It came out in Information Systems Journal earlier this year. And it's about mobilizing information systems for a digital economy. Same principle. He said there's research on circular economy. Circular economy is a topic in economics and sustainable, right? Yeah. And he says, well, where's IS in this, right? Because they're interested in everything digital, but we're not listening, right? And he wrote this paper with some others, and it came out. So it can be done. So. Is it difficult? Absolutely, right? It was a conceptual piece that usually has a bit of literature review in it. Yeah. You're only left to your rhetoric devices to make a contribution claim. I think that's the dangerous part. The difficult part. You don't have any statistical significant evidence to back you up, right? So that's
just it. Any conceptual paper is always harder to publish than an empirical a paper with data, and here's the thing: we see the papers that are published as new people in the field. They see it and they're like, I can do that. It's like, well, yeah, of course you could do that, but you didn't see the 80 that were rejected that were just as good, right? It's such a judgment call. There isn't the data to fall back on. I usually try to encourage as much as possible new people to just focus on data. Get data, write on data. That's your lower risk. But this is what I want to do. There's one more type of contribution I had in mind, but so far we have, okay, it's not a surprise. It's something we all know. So what do? Boundary conditions, we unpack it, we do that sort of thing. The second is the surprise. But there's a rhetoric to the surprise. We have to build up assumptions, then we have to somehow contradict them. Then there's this conversation starter genre that you pointed out. There's another one that's particularly strong and qualitative, although I can find it, I'm sure, in all sorts of studies. But it's this idea of cleverly making sense of something. Essentially, and I'm not sure we want to, but making, and sometimes it involves a buzzword or an image or a metaphor, right? And a couple real quickly that I think I can point out here are, Leonardi's famous paper on imbrication. Everyone loves it. People outside of our field love it. It's just a very useful paper, and it has to do with the material agency, so technology acting, human agency, humans acting, and there's this kind of imbricating process through which whatever. One could argue, I'm not saying I'm making this argument, but one could argue that, go back to, say, Leonard Barton's 1988 paper of mutual adaptation, where humans and technologies adapt over time and whatever. It's different. Their conception of the changing of the technology is clearly different than his idea of material agency. But the intuition, and certainly the way it's used, that mutual adaptation, is very similar to imbrication. But people love the imbrication, and they could just as easily go back for probably 90% of the times people cite imbrication, they could cite mutual adaptation. But they like the word imbrication, and one could argue similarly with sociomateriality. Now, sociomateriality was making a strong kind of ontological inseparability argument, but for most of the time that we cite sociomateriality, we could probably just cite sociotechnical. We could probably just, right? So they come up with a new word, they do some hair splitting, some nuanced difference in the paper that probably gets them published, but then the way people cite it, is socio-material imbrication rather than socio-technical and
I agree. I tell you a short story that I think goes along the same way. So I mentioned this before. There in Berlin, there's different types of universities, right? When we talked about identity, a little bit, I mentioned there's some university identities, and they sort of breed different types of scholars. So I was invited to talk at Freie University Berlin, which has a very strong sociology, very theoretical department. Sort of very big thinkers there, right? So I go in and I actually talked about some ideas about digital entrepreneurship, theoretical ideas. And so I talk, and it was a really hefty little seminar, good question. And then this very big shot professor says, I'm like, okay, so, Latour said all of this in the 60s, and have you read his stuff? So what's new here? And my response to this was that, of course, it was like, okay. And I said, yeah, sure he did. In some sense, all of this has been said before, but it was said in different words. It was said on a very different level of abstraction. Everything I can construct as an actor network theory, everything. If I wanted to, but still the contribution here is that I'm developing concepts that are of interest to this particular group of people here on this particular level of abstraction. And that's the point I'm getting to, right? So this is, I think, really the value proposition of some of these low level mid-range theory that make him so much more attractive than this grand level stuff where everything can be a system, everything can be a network, and everything can be a structuration, that's great, but it doesn't help me. It's really not very assertive, not normative, not prescriptive in any way. So every now and then I need to come like Paul Leonardi and I take the same idea and say, this is what it looks like here. And it's, with nuance, with specificity, with situatedness. And that makes it really, really interesting. Even so, from 10,000 feet, it all looks the same.
Yeah. And sometimes it's good to just remind people that, all right, there's this tension here. I found it. I mean, what are we? We're just a bunch of, regular people trying to think deeply about a topic and do some research. What we come up with is not going to be earth shattering, but that doesn't mean it's not a nice contribution to the discourse, right? So
again, you're putting it very negatively. I mean, you can put a little bit of positive spin on what you just said. I mean, like if you think about what is information systems, I mean, number one, I think that's an applied science. Yeah, that's number one. Number two, it's interdisciplinary. It's nestled in one little corner of between the social sciences and the computing sciences, etc., and so forth. No, we're not gonna do the Latour or I don't know, a Giddens type of work, because that's not what our field is. Our field is looking at, okay, there's different technologies in certain contexts hitting people and all sorts of things happens. Go and explain that. If you think that is a marginal thing in the field of science, well, then clearly you've picked the wrong field. If you want to do earth-shattering, groundbreaking stuff, well, why don't you study psychology if you're interested in human behavior? And if you're interested in big social theory, well, maybe you should have gone for philosophy instead. So I think that argument is just no need to feel ashamed, because it's one of the nice things about applied science is this notion of relevance, valorization, all this impact. I think it comes so natural that I don't even like having these debates. It's we don't have a problem with relevance and impact. Not
some would argue with you.
Yeah, of course, but that's how I see it. Like it's fairly well compared to other fields. It's fairly easy to construct something relevant out of a finding. Try doing the same thing if you're the guy that's really big on the difference between Monet and Manet and which of them painted shade of green a little bit differently 300 years ago.
That's true. Well, the thing that I find, and maybe we need a whole separate podcast on relevance, is that oftentimes when I work with industry, they don't need my research. They need my course, right? They need the stuff we've been teaching. They need the stuff that has already been published and has already been vetted oftentimes, right? Not always.
I agree.
Yeah. And our research is usually, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, and moving things forward in a way that maybe is of less interest to some practitioners. So
I agree. And my extension of that is that that also means that my research papers, they don't need to be relevant. They don't need to be readable even by CIOs. I don't write God knows, a top paper for the CIOs. I wrote them for the Nicks of this world and other people who either like it or they don't like it. And they write emails to criticize me or whatever. That's who I write them for. I don't write them for the manager in the company next door, because it's a horrible format for them anyway.
Yeah. Oh, it is. Yeah. And every 10 years or so, every decade or a couple, there are people who crystallize the key insights and turn them into textbooks and make HBR publications and do whatever. And that's cool. They do that, but that doesn't mean that every one of our papers has to be an HBR publication.
No, I think that we can do all of that, and all of that should be done, but not all of that should be done all the time by everyone. By us. Yeah. So
we need so this is what I'm hearing. We need a relevance podcast in the future. Yep. We need a theory podcast in the future, because I can't get enough of discussing theory.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, it's not that we haven't touched on that topic before.
Right,
I think what you need, my friend, you need a good quantitative method podcast, not for other people. So just you get the hang of it a little bit.
You mean me? I published more quantitative papers than you have. You're the qualitative and conceptual modeling. I do quantitative work. I do a ton of quantitative work.
Well, why don't we let people decide on whether that is as true as your claim on beating me in basketball?
I'll teach you how to do a quantitative work.
Okay. All right. We'll do that next time. Okay.
All right, my brother. I will see you.
Bye-bye.